later. But anyway, here I am, and we will continue to try to make this a little bit more seamless. So I hope everybody is having a nice early fall day. It's certainly been interesting, at least here in Southern California, to watch the light change, because we don't really have seasons, but we do have, a clear distinction in the way the Earth is traveling in relation to the light. And so this change of season in some ways can bring forth bursts of creativity, because there's a novelty to the sights and the smells in relation to summer, but also there is a knowing, an implicit knowing from our past, from our childhoods, and what all these sights and smells represent to us. So, for instance, we just saw children roaming around, and adults, in costumes over the weekend, and that's always been a signifier of the beginning of fall to me. I guess back to school was the first one, but certainly Halloween, which kicks off the holiday seasons. And the holidays can be incredibly creative also when we think about food and gift giving and decorations and things of that nature. So in the spirit of welcoming fall and the Earth's amazing creativity and how it shifts and changes, we're going to talk about that today. So Erica Young says that if sex and creativity are often seen by dictators as subversive activities, it's because they lead to the knowledge that you own your own body and with it your own voice, and that's the most revolutionary insight of all. And what this reminds me of is, some of you know I spent some time in Russia the summer before last, and something really bad just happened on my end. Tom, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you still.
Well, I just
lost the video.
Yeah, I didn't just lose the video. I lost my entire connection to the PowerPoint and everything. So I'm going to close that and try again. And while I'm trying, I will continue to talk. Oh, that's just so weird. Just went down completely. Being in Russia was eye-opening because of, being in relationship and communication with so many people who had lived through the Soviet system. And in a system like that, there's absolutely no voice for creativity. There's just no voice or anything going on in a place like that. And the subjugation of that creativity, which would be art, writing, painting, any of and things that we do and don't want and we are and aren't happy with in life. And, of course, the Russians completely shut that down at one point. And I think, the Russians themselves and some of the world is worried that that may happen again. Who knows where that's going. But the point being that when dictators move in, they definitely steal our voices. And we also see that oppression around the world now. We see it in the Middle East with women being oppressed and not having a voice. And historically, we've had leaders like Václav Havel who've been arrested for their voice. And so the most revolutionary thing we can do personally is to speak up for ourselves. The act of creation itself works as a divine mirror, revealing that we receive back what we send out. And I think in the most concrete ways, we see that in nature, like when we plant a garden, for example. When you plant those seeds or plants or whatever they are, nature gives us back a mirror of our efforts, because when we water and fertilize and tend to, those things grow. And likewise with our own creativity. There can be times in our lives where we feel uncreative or stuck, or like we have a vision for what our lives want to be like, but we don't even know where to begin. And sometimes taking the smallest move forward gives the universe or nature or the divine something to grab onto, some kind of traction. So it's not enough to imagine something, but you really have to put it into action in order for the universal forces to grab onto something and assist you in moving your creativity forward. We know with children that it's imaginative play that has them learning and has us learning about our own self and the reality of the world around us. Through original projects as adolescents, we learn our strengths and our weaknesses. And play is the way that human beings learn. There's lots of data on this now, too, that imaginative play is one of the most exciting and fun ways to learn, and it's one of the best ways to learn because of the way it activates both hemispheres of the brain. And sadly, so much of play and creativity has been taken out of our educational system because, you know, in places we don't seem to have money to put towards that. So what we see, at least in LA in the school district, is that, you know, kids are just taught to memorize answers and spit them out so that they can test. But there's very little money left anymore for any kind of arts. A lot of public schools have to scrap together money, or the teachers bring their own supplies to draw or make music or anything along those lines. So one of the ways I think adults suffer is that they don't play enough. And sometimes if you have a problem you want to solve, one of the best ways to solve it is to go out and do something. Move your body, you know, whether it's playing on a beach or taking a hike and goofing around, or making a collage, which is very creative and it's very right-brained instead of trying to figure it out. Get a piece of poster board and take out, you know, get a bunch of magazines and start clipping out pictures of feeling states and colors and ideas of what moves you, and see what that brings you when you're finished with it. What is that final board telling you, whether it's an 8 by 10 piece of paper or a big piece of poster board? What creativity has emerged from you that tells you what your intuition wants for you? One of the things Dan Siegel talks about in his new book, Brainstorm, which is about the adolescent brain, is just how important it is for adolescents to be socially engaged, to play, to be creative, and that's because of the brain's malleability and the growth that's taking place at that time. And it's through creativity that we fulfill our purpose in life. And this is a really challenging question, too, this matter of purpose. What am I meant to be doing here? Very few of us sort of pop out and know that we have a purpose and this is our mission and this is what we're going to do in life. Many of us just sort of follow something that seems interesting or inspiring or curious, and before we know it, opportunities are beginning to how our purpose sort of comes to us. So you might know that, let's say you want to be a helper, for instance, but a helper doesn't mean you should be a therapist or you should be an emergency technician or you should be a politician or a minister. It just means that you want to help. And just knowing that and then getting creative about exploring different options of what helping means will start to inform you about what's burgeoning inside of you. So if you think about creativity as an emergent process as opposed to a knowing process, something that we feel and we find out about as we go along, there's inherently a play state in that. Allowing the free flow of novel ideas gains us a higher perspective, a broader overview than the narrow vantage point of unquestioning assimilation. And I think that's sort of a complicated way of saying what I just said, that when novel ideas pop into our head and we don't censor them, we don't listen to a critical voice that says, oh, that's a bad idea, or that's a dumb idea, or that will never happen. But really, I think it's the act of daydreaming that most of us don't have a lot of time for anymore, but children have lots of time to daydream and imagine and wonder. And it's that daydream that allows novel ideas to pop up out from, inside of us, and to say, wow, what if I could do that? And sometimes I like to ask myself, and this is not an easy question, but if I could do anything in the world I wanted to do right now, and other times I just start imagining other ways of living. What would it be like to just live sustainably, to leave everything and go live somewhere, maybe even in a foreign country, and to farm and live off the earth and not be contributing to any kind of problems other than my own little problems? What would that be like? What would that feel like? How would I be? How could I imagine that? And that may not mean that I'm going to uproot myself and, take off and leave, but it does start to give me some spaciousness internally about other possibilities in my current life. So sometimes radical free flow of novel ideas is good medicine. And that does give a broader perspective of over the kind of day in and day out, this is sort of my lot in life, this is what I do, this is what I have to do. It gives a little bit of elasticity to one's life. So does anybody have any questions about that? Any thoughts coming up? Anything you've read recently you want to share? How has creativity helped you to fulfill your own purpose in life? Well, I think it was because I allowed myself to be open and willing to not know what I was doing. If I go all the way back to graduate school, all I knew was that I had to figure out a way to support myself because I, had a lot of menial jobs and none of them were, gratifying in any way. I was just supporting myself. And I realized that I wanted to do something that had meaning and that was helpful to the planet, that didn't create a lot of landfill. And so I went to graduate school to study psychology. It was really my own therapy that sent me to graduate school because it seemed like, first of all, I was getting so much help from my therapist, and then it seemed kind of amazing that I could talk to people all day long and get paid for it, and that could be a career. And so I dove into school, which really stretched my head in so many different ways. And I started to think about all kinds of possibilities from there because graduate school for clinical psychology does not necessarily lead one to becoming a psychotherapist. I could have become an educator. I could have worked with any number of populations. But that was the jumping off point for expanding my horizons and my world and shaking things up in a creative way. Someone says, I'm currently teaching a workshop in sex and creativity. I've taught this as an 8-week course, and I'm currently teaching it as a weekend workshop with 12 students. I'm curious about your ideas about activities for adults that help people play together. Well, I think that's a good question. I think of play as laughter, as having a pillow fight as an adult, as skipping down the street, certainly any kind of creative art or movement. There are also movement exercises that people can do, which I can't really demonstrate here in this little camera, but that create a sense of play also, where you are sort of exchanging sound and movement with other people. So anything that moves the body and engages all of the social aspects of the human are play states. Getting people to play tag or hide and seek, I mean, these are playful activities too. But play can be in the form of dance, and sex is a form of play too. People think about sex as being so kind of intense and dour and super passionate the way that we see it in movies in this kind of torrid way. But also there can be laughter and giggling and tickling that can be part of sexual play too. Tumbling, wrestling. I would recommend wrestling with a lover, not so much a stranger maybe, but you never know. So those are the sorts of things that people can engage in. Now that it's fall, having leaf fights if you live in an area where there are lots of leaves that are falling from the trees, maybe not California so much, but anything like that that's silly, engaging in the body, that creates laughter, creates a sense of fun and playfulness. And creativity is about options. And when we get creative, I have this bag of carrots, so I just have to eat raw carrots. Well, I have a bag of carrots. What can I do with these carrots? Well, I could juice them. I could make a soup out of them. I could puree them and make a paste out of them. I could saute them and put brown sugar on them and make them sort of a dessert sort of item. When we start to think out of the box, we can be more malleable and start to see, instead of seeing just our limitations in our lives, start to see ways that we can open it up. Another example might be, this is sort of concrete, that, if you have a small space that you live in, a small house, well, what's a way that you can maybe open it up, open the windows, open the back door, bring some of the outside inside, do something to make the space feel more expansive. And, that's sort of like a concrete, maybe decorating tip. But for our own psyches, when we don't limit ourselves to thinking, I can only do this, or I've never done that, or nobody would want me, sort of these negative narratives that we tell ourselves, then that limits us, and it doesn't make a space for us to think out of the box and see ways that we could change. But the lack of emotional differentiation or healthy education imposes paralyzing fears, as well as some of the most black and white judgmentalism that ever incarcerated the human mind. And usually these sort of negative thoughts come from high levels of criticism in our childhood. And so we want to be very, very careful of looking at what ways we're still tied to our family of origin. Like, what were the rules and roles in your family of origin that said that, or still say, that you can only do things certain ways, and if you do things in other way, then you're going to fail, or you're not going to be able to make a living, or any number of other stories that we're told. This can have us living from a fear-based place where we don't ever take risks, and creativity is about risking. And then there's also the judgments that we hear over and over again that keep us imprisoned. And it may be a good idea to write down, what are your lists of judgments? Or similarly, what are the tapes that run in your head that came from your family of origin? What are the things that stop you from being creative? Because if we look at this sentence or this phrase about the incarceration of the mind, so if you just take the leap of letting your mind out of prison by daydreaming, by wondering, by imagining, nobody's going to know about that. It doesn't cost you any money. It's not going to hurt anybody. But you're just letting your mind wander to possibility. And the pragmatism comes into, okay, what one thing would I have to do in order to make some part of that possibility happen and to have the experience of it? Because I think we don't really know what we want until we actually try it. You don't know whether you want to be in a relationship with someone unless you get in relationship with that person and find out who they are. You won't know whether you like a job or a sport unless you dive into it, commit to it, and do it, and have the direct experience of it. But it all starts with this, with letting the mind out of prison. Rigid adherence to familial, social, or cultural dogma makes it impossible to perceive and value our own personal opinions. And that's because our personal opinions get squashed, so they can't get cultivated, so we can't possibly know what they are. And that kind of rigidity goes back to the Erica Jong quote about, countries or politics shutting us down, squashing our voices, squashing our imagination. So another exercise would be to think about or write about what of your family or societies or cultural rules and dogma had you shutting down any possibility of who you are or who you want to be. And after you do that, after you really look at the ways that you are afraid, the ways that you have judgments about yourself, the way you have all these rigid adherence to your cultural norms or people telling you what to do, can you find your own creative choices in the midst of that rubble? If you look at it historically, were there times when you broke out of that dogma or out of those expectations of what others wanted you to be? And if you are like most people, you probably rebelled against those cultural messages and dogmas and fears. My guess is you did, or you wouldn't be on this call. First of all, you have to have found this call in order to get on it, and you have to be way out of a rigid box if you're even interested in these topics. So you found your way out of that. And for many of us, those things, those voices, they can initially be crushing like a vice, but eventually they start to loosen up, and then they kind of float around sometimes like space trash around our heads. And so we don't want to violently, exterminate them, but we want to gently, toss them out slowly but surely. And one of the ways of doing that is to look at how you, or what creative choices got you out of the maybe rigid family you grew up in, or the paralyzing fears you once had, or the breaking out of some sort of, cultural or religious dogma. How did you do that? What does that say about you? What unique abilities do you have that made you able to do that? And for a lot of us, we end up rebelling mightily as teenagers as a way to get out of constraint, because we can't stand the constraint we're being put in, and rebellion is the only way we know how. It's the only way the adolescent, immature person knows how to get out of restraint. But once we get out of it and we realize that we're actually hurting ourselves, and we stop hurting ourselves, which is what addiction and recovery are about, then there's a space to say, wow, that was actually pretty creative. It might have been destructive and self-destructive, but it certainly served a purpose. And how else was I creative? And what are the strengths and the creativity I want to keep? And what are the rebellious pieces and the self-critical pieces I want to get rid of? And think about what your personal style is and what your actions express about you, because in that is the power of your own personal creativity. So does anybody have any thoughts about this section? Well, it's a quiet group today. Last month we were a very chatty group. All right, so what about romantic creativity then? We are our own strictest censors, as I was saying. So presumably you mean guilt and shame when it comes to the rules. I think that's what you're talking about. And that's part of the process, I think. That is part of our own releasing and noticing that guilt and shame. Does it have to do with your own personal values, or does it have to do with that which has been imposed upon you? Because if I, for example, were to do something and it made me feel guilty, like I was gossiping behind somebody's back, and I thought, oh, I don't like that. That doesn't sit right with my integrity. I need to go back and say to that person, I was really out of line when I told you that so-and-so wasn't invited to so-and-so's party, and I wish I hadn't said that about myself. That's my own personal standard, as opposed to sharing something with a friend because I needed to in order to sort something out for myself, but in the meantime I might have said something bad or not nice about another person, but I'm so riddled with guilt because of family messages. Then I have to look at, wow, either I'm going to take care of myself or I'm going to be loyal to these family messages. And which is it now as an adult? What serves me? What keeps me within my value system? And how do I then start to let go those feelings that I'm hurting someone in my family? And that is the process of becoming more integrated, more differentiated, and more of a whole human being. And sometimes it's just tolerating, first of all, noticing the guilt, noticing that I want to make it go away or I want to caretake to someone else over taking care of what I really need. And that's enough. That's the beginning of starting to untangle and let it go. So we have to be careful about not using guilt and shame as a club against ourselves for having guilt and shame, but noticing the guilt, noticing the shame, asking ourselves if it's really warranted. Like if I stole something and I felt shame, I should feel shame. That's an appropriate feeling. But if I didn't hurt anybody else, and I'm not violating anybody else, and I'm not violating my own value systems, then I have to really be curious about where that shame is coming from. And typically it's an old reaction in the body that was conditioned long, long ago, I would say, second or third year of life even, and that we have to just be curious about the way that is still alive in ourselves and how that keeps us from feeling like we have any rights. And, of course, if someone feels so profoundly guilty or shameful for even being alive, then I would say they have a tremendous amount of trauma and that warrants a deeper psychotherapeutic setting with somebody who can really help them start to become more integrated, because these are what I would call disintegrated self-states. So when we stop censoring ourselves or repressing our own creative urges, or the creative urges of our loved ones, well, I just goofed up that sentence. Let me just try reading it that way. Then we are our own strictest censors and often repressing the creative urges of ourselves and loved ones even more than we repress sexual urges. So, yeah, we can, when we're repressing any judgment that occurs with that, and if we're judging others to that degree, then we are also full of what we call hedonic or excitatory proposition humans can engage in, certainly in certain stages of our lives. It makes us feel incredibly good, and in that is a creative force and energy. It's why love poems have been written, poems of inspiration. It's why the muse came about, centuries ago, with people being inspired by those they loved. And if we are repressing and judging ourselves, then we certainly will not be able to express ourselves sexually. Here's another question about how do you address guilt and shame in this situation? I think that was the same. Sorry, that was the same question. So back to the slide now. And can you recognize the creativity of others? What happens when you see other people's creativity? Are you excited, inspired? Do you get jealous? Do you get judgmental? Do you diminish them? Are you dismissive of it? In what ways do you recognize the creativity of others? Because others' creativity can be incredibly inspiring, and sometimes it won't look like yours. And when it doesn't look like yours, what do you do with that? Because many people can get threatened by that, and they can use it to beat themselves up with. So, in other words, I saw this beautiful painting, but I'll never be able to do that, so I'm not going to even bother drawing. Or I saw this amazing dance, and I can't move my body that way, so I don't want to dance because I look too dorky. This could go on and on, right? I'm not going to do that because I'm comparing myself to others as opposed to, wow, that's fantastic or interesting or exciting, and I'm just going to feel what that feels like inside of me and then see what comes out of me in one of these forums and not judge what comes out of me. And notice the particular clothes your loved ones wear, the interesting food they serve, or the innovative work they do, and show your appreciation of these. That is a way to cultivate creativity. So there's nothing more giving and loving than noticing what someone has chosen to wear, whether it's a shirt or a purse or a cool scarf they have on, and just to see how that thing kind of blends with their personality and who they are. Likewise, I mean, for me, one of the things I most love to do is go to people's houses for dinner, because I think cooking is an act of love because it takes so much work and it's incredibly creative, and it's always fun to see how people put food together, and it's always good to taste it too. So complimenting the cook, being appreciative of any beautiful thing that you see during the course of the day is really an affirmation and recognition of your own beauty and your own capacity for creativity. And let yourself be moved by the unique ideas under these actions that they are trying to express. And I think you'll be surprised if you start to do that. Get really, really curious about how people come to put things together, whether it's themselves or their space or their ideas, because we're all so unique, and it's so easy in our busy world to kind of gloss over it or take it for granted, whatever the it may be, and to be curious, not judgmental about it. So does anybody see in other people, or what impact creativity has on you when you see it? Thoughts, feelings? Yeah, okay. Somebody says, I've often have issues in dating with the way they, I've often have issues in dating with the way they create themselves. Not sure what that means. Let's see. Maybe when are you talking about when you go on a date that you have difficulty with the way the person has put themselves together in terms of how, I'm not sure what that question means. So Eleanor says that, she says, it thrills me to my core, it's why I do this. So it sounds like even like this conversation feels inspiring to Eleanor, and that it's resonating with you, and that just the act of hearing me talk about what you probably know already or you're embodying creates a resonance and a sense of wanting to be creative and be inspired. And this is what we're talking about here. She says also people showing up as their essential selves and the vulnerability and the willingness to be seen. And that is an enormously creative process, because when we show up with our lovers, for example, in a place of vulnerability and with a willingness to be seen, then there is a creativity that emerges from that, and there is a sexiness from that. You know, in Hollywood, we think of sexiness quite a bit, or the way it gets constructed here is in this kind of harsh, like super sexualized way that you see on billboards, and, you know, typically it's like super tight clothes, super high heels, kind of this overblown, eroticized sexuality that can be kind of asexual because it's so, there's a hard edge about it. Whereas when people are in their sort of essential selves or native selves, when they are in play states, when they're open-hearted and loving and laughing, there is an incredible sexuality about this, and a place for some sort of creative process to emerge between two people, whether they're dancing or painting together or ultimately having sex. And, you know, this kind of sensuality is what really produces a real sexuality, not some sort of constructed poser sexuality that we see in magazines. When we recall the joy and meaning that our most innovative states have brought us, we should conclude that the same creativity belongs in our sex life. So think about that. Think about what happens when you've been your most creative, and can you bring that creativity to your sexuality, that willingness to fight for what you really want, to work hard, to reveal yourself, to grapple with what is rough and rigorous, you know, the fighter in you. Are you willing to fight for the kind of sex life you want also? So here's a repeat of the question before, saying, I don't like their clothes often or their food with somebody I'm dating. That's often a stumbling block. If they're artists, I often don't like their art, and it's hard to enthusiastically support them. I'm not like this with friends or strangers, though. I know enough to work through this, but it always comes up. Well, I would say if it's always coming up, that when we start picking at people, first of all, if you don't like their clothes or their food or their art, then you probably shouldn't be in relationships with them. But if it comes up with every person you go out with, then that is a way to create separation. That's often a way to avoid intimacy. Whenever we start judging people and it starts getting nitpicky, that's a sign to me that there's something inside of me that's uncomfortable, that I'm not willing to get vulnerable, I'm not willing to get close. And this happens with people when we're more avoidant. The nearer we get to someone in close proximity to them, the more we'll start to push away through being judgmental or picking at them. So you've got to be careful about asking yourself how much of this is me and how much of it is that I don't like this person's taste, or it doesn't jive with me, or it's too unusual, and it's not what I want. Where this next point is the concept of sexual creativity might intimidate us at first because we fear who knows what situations might arise. It's particularly intimidating to those who are overly compliant and susceptible to whatever half-baked ideas are suggested. So let's break this down and think about sexual creativity can be intimidating because if you're meeting somebody in the sexual arena and your stance is, I'm going to be open to the sensations of my body, to what this person is bringing, to being risky and taking chances, there is a fear of the unknown in that because then we might not be safe with that person, or they may want to do something that we don't feel comfortable doing. And the only way to address that, especially if the person is susceptible to other people's ideas, is to have boundaried conversations to begin with. So to really know what you like, what you don't like, to be honest with yourself about what you don't and don't like sexually and really know yourself, and then be in honest conversations with your partner about that, which makes a case for getting to know somebody a little bit before you dive into having sex with them. If you're going to have sex with a stranger, if it's an anonymous situation, then you want to be careful about how open you are going to be because you don't know what you're getting into, and it could potentially even be a dangerous situation. But with a lover that you know, that you're engaged with, you can talk about what you're afraid of, how you want to be creative, what you're willing to do, and then also have safe words around wanting to stop if you don't want to go any further. So there are no half-baked ideas coming into play to surprise you at the last minute. So this is, again, one of the paradoxes that I talk about quite frequently, where we want to be open and creative and have fun while also staying safe and taking care of ourselves and our partners if need be. And by strengthening our boundaries, which is what we're talking about, self-trust and morality, we can safely cultivate a healthy sexual creativity whose acts can bring us deeper connections and greater understanding of ourselves and others. So I think when you have a toddler and you put them in a playpen with all of their things, they are happy. They're contained, they have a place to play, they know what the limits are, and they're pretty content. But if you let that toddler just go, or worse yet, get lost, they start to feel very, very scared and uncontained. And so that's what boundaries do for us. They give us a sense of where the parameters are so we don't get lost. They're also not meant to be rigid. They're meant to be somewhat permeable so that if I set a boundary and I say, no, I'm never going to engage in this sex act, and then, years down the road I end up with somebody who I love and trust and they want to try it, and I feel like I really want to challenge that boundary. That boundary now feels maybe like a little bit of a limitation. I want to challenge that with cautiously and curiously, and I have to communicate that with my partner too. So the boundary has to be strong, but it also can be permeable or flexible. When I trust myself, when my own version of morality, my values, not some overarching morality, which is where this conversation started with societal rules and roles and regulations, but my own value system is in place, then I can start to feel creative in the sexual realm. And those acts, whatever they may be, ones that I know about, novel ones, can start to create a deeper connection and a greater understanding of myself and of the other person I'm with. And I believe sex over time is really about us growing ourselves over time. Our sex life is not a static sexuality. If it was, we'd all be doing what we were doing when we were 14 or 16 or 26. But we're not. Our sexuality is changing all the time. And to be curious about those changes instead of making them limitations is about a sexual creativity. So that, I think, is one of the challenges of living a very long life today, that we've got to get as interested in our changing bodies and get as creative sexually as we get creative about any other number of things we do. So any questions here about these points? Well, then ask yourself how you can focus on your creativity today. Maybe it's going home and, putting a pumpkin on your table, or maybe it's talking to your partner about some sexual limitations you've had and how you want to be more creative, but you don't really know what that means. But are they supportive of you trying things and trying to bring something into the mix that has more to do with where you've been scared and where you want to expand, rather than trying to coerce them or convince them into doing something they haven't been willing to do. So really make this about yourself, about your own personal ways of connecting deeply with yourself and your own expand some of your limitations. And I would also invite you to think about, as we do enter the holiday season, what ways do you want to get creative? What are some things you want to try that you haven't tried in the past, that you've told yourself you wanted to do? And those acts of creativity, whether it's saying, this year I want to string popcorn on my Christmas tree, and I've never done that before, or I want to try making something for Thanksgiving I haven't made before, or I want to take a trip and go do something with my partner that we've been talking about doing but we haven't ever done, and I really want to try it this holiday season. See how those things open and create a portal to your sexuality. So sex is not just about exploring sex in sexuality. It's about exploring it in our day-to-day lives, our sensuality, who we are, how we, as we start to work and shift and change those in our daily lives, our waking lives, it also creates a flexibility inside of us to start to become more sexually fluid beings as well. So one of the things I want to let you know, which I'm very excited to let you know, is that we have our hardcover book, The Daily Meditations, Mirror of Intimacy, arriving today. We have them coming from China today. We have a few of them coming in. But by mid-December, we will have a full shipment at Amazon, which you will be able to buy. So if you go to Amazon.com and you type in Mirror of Intimacy, you will see our live page up there. We've only printed 1,500 of these hardcovers, and they're beautiful books with orange covers and purple papers, and all of the daily meditations are in one book. So they're a fantastic gift to give for Christmas or New Year's, or of course the Valentine's Day holiday. And we'll be sending out notices also in the daily meditations. So thank you, as always, for your support, and I look forward to hearing from you maybe next time about what creative endeavors you came up with. And have a happy Thanksgiving, a happy fall, and I will see you somewhere around the 1st of December. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.